So, should we be ignoring negative news, be optimistic about progress and defend Enlightenment values? Cognitive scientist and professor of psychology at Harvard University, Steven Pinker, thinks we should. His latest book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress, debates the impact of trade, free inquiry, the contact of peoples, and warns that despairing of the state of humanity could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, when delivering difficult and bad news as part of this job every day, we spoke about his reasoning for this perspective.
Well, by many measures of human flourishing, the state of humanity has been improving. Fewer of us are dying of disease, fewer of us are dying of hunger, more of us are living in democracies, we're more affluent, we are better educated, we're more literate, girls as well as boys. These are trends that you can't easily appreciate from the news because they never happen all at once. They creep up on you as gradual trends, and it's only when you look at data and plot them over time that you realize how much tremendous progress has taken place beneath our noses.
But when you consider, say, the brutal wars in Syria and Yemen and 10,000 dead in Afghanistan last year alone, it's hard to believe, say, for example, that we're better off in terms of people dying in wars.
Well, that's true, and what that shows is that war has not disappeared. It says nothing about whether there's more or less war in the past. I mean, it's just a simple matter of arithmetic. You can't look at how much there is right now and say that it's increasing or decreasing until you compare it with how much took place in the past. When you look at how much took place in the past, you realize how much worse things were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We don't appreciate it now when we concentrate on the remaining horrors, but there were horrific wars such as the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the war in Vietnam, the partition of India, the Bangladesh War of Independence, the Korean War, which killed far more people than even the brutal wars of today. And if we only focus on the present, we ought to be aware of the suffering that continues to exist, but we can't take that as evidence that things have gotten worse unless we remember what happened in the past.
After World War II, though, there was this global pact to ensure these kind of atrocities were not perpetrated again, but yet they are. Why?
True, there is a horrific war going on now, but in the 1980s there were horrific wars going on all over the world. Africa was in flames. Latin America had a number of brutal civil wars going on. The terrible wars that remain are civil wars. Less and less frequent are interstate wars, wars where one country declares war against another, and those typically have death tolls that exceed the death tolls from civil wars. And the international regime has been not completely successful, but largely successful in driving that kind of war to obsolescence.
When we look at global inequality, though, we see the richest 1% controlling half of the world's wealth. This adds to the sense that there is this growing inequality.
Globally, inequality is decreasing. That is, if you don't look within a wealthy country like Britain or the United States, but look across the globe, either comparing countries or comparing people worldwide, as best we can tell, inequality is decreasing because so many poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer. Now, within the wealthy countries of the Anglosphere, inequality is increasing. But although inequality brings with it a number of serious problems, such as disproportionate political power to the wealthy, inequality itself is not a problem. What we have to focus on is the well-being of those at the bottom end of the scale, of the poor and the lower middle class. And those have not been actually decreasing once you take into account government transfers and benefits.
So how do you explain this disconnect from how the world actually is from your point of view and the way we perceive it?
Partly it's because if your impression of the world is driven by journalism, then as long as various evils haven't gone to zero, there'll always be enough of them to fill the news. And if journalism isn't accompanied by a bit of historical context, that is not just what's bad now, but how bad it was in the past, and statistical context, namely how many wars, how many terrorist attacks, what is the rate of homicide, then you can, our intuitions, since they're driven by images and narratives narratives and anecdotes can be systematically distorted by the news unless it's presented in historical and statistical context.
So many people are disillusioned by the Trump presidency, not just in the US, the impact in the US, but globally. How do we contextualize the Trump presidency?
Trumpism is part, of course, of a larger phenomenon of authoritarian populism that also has resulted in gains in Eastern Europe and in other parts of Europe. It is a backlash against many of the values that I argue in Enlightenment Now are responsible for the progress that we've enjoyed. It's kind of a counter-enlightenment ideology that Trumpism promotes, namely, instead of universal human well-being, it focuses on the glory of the nation and assumes that nations are in zero-sum competition against each other as opposed to cooperating globally. It's sympathetic to a religious morality as opposed to a universal humanistic morality. It's opposed to international free trade, which has been a force that has increased not just wealth but peace. It ignores the institutions of democracy, which were specifically implemented to avoid a charismatic authoritarian leader from wielding power, but subjects him or her to the restraints of a rule-governed system and checks and balances, which Donald Trump seems to think is rather a nuisance to his own ability to voice the greatness of the people directly. So in many ways, all of the Enlightenment forces that I think have led to the progress that we've enjoyed are being pushed back by Trump and authoritarian populism. But this is a tension that has been in play for a couple of hundred years. No sooner did the Enlightenment happen than that counter-enlightenment grew up to oppose it, and every once in a while it does make reappearances.
So do we then presume that something will come up to counter this particular period?
That's right. No, and I would not prophesy that it will go away, but nor would I prophesy that it represents a defeat or crumbling or meltdown of democracy, as some commentators have said. We don't know what will happen, but the fact that there are these authoritarian forces pushing back doesn't mean that they'll succeed. And in some ways, there's a tide of change of values that's been going on for many decades that's unlikely to go into reverse overnight. There's been a general push toward gender equality, toward tolerance of homosexuality, toward independence in child rearing, toward citizen empowerment in governance. They've been going on decade after decade. Now, it's possible that it'll all of a sudden go into reverse, but unlikely.
Despite the sense of loss of power for many people, though, it's also coupled with this voter apathy at the polls. How do you explain that?
Part of it comes from a cynicism or a fatalism about the institutions of democracy, which I think is misplaced. I think when the picture that we're given of the world and of our nation is that it's just a disaster, one crisis after another. Well, people say, Clinton, Trump, what's the difference? The world is deteriorating no matter which leader we pick. And so you get Donald Trump. Unlike some of the people energized on the political right, such as the evangelical Christians, who have a full-throated defense of their standard bearer. And part of what I've tried to do in Enlightenment Now is just remind people of the accomplishments of liberal democracy and of the Enlightenment institutions like science, like universities, like international organizations that we take for granted.
What do you think the impact of social media and its explosion has been?
Well, it's too early to say. That's the kind of the question of the day, and we're living in an era in which everything that takes place is blamed on social media. I think the role has probably been exaggerated. It's too soon to say, but a lot of the forces that we deplore now came before the advent of social media.
I really appreciated talking to you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.